the domestic violence classes were court ordered. It was 1997 when I started taking them, and it was near the middle of 1999 when I stopped taking them. What I found with the domestic violence classes is because they were required, the people weren't necessarily there. Most of the people weren't necessarily there to get healthy.
Right.
They were just there to, quote, do their time.
Uh-huh.
They didn't end up helping me an awful lot, to be quite frank with you. It was the relationship with Bob, and what was interesting is when Bob said, DV doesn't stand for domestic violence anymore, Damon. It stands for Dream and a Vision. And it was when I started, instead of focusing on today and all the things I'd done wrong today, which is what I experienced in those classes, and I started focusing on the future, is when I really started changing. My life dramatically improved from that point on.
It's time for the SHAIR Recovery Podcast, where we bring you amazing life-changing success stories from addicts and alcoholics all over the world who share their inspiring journey in recovery. And now, here's your host,
Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of TSP, the SHAIR Podcast. And on today's episode, we have Damon Stoddard joining us on the show. Now, Damon is the author of Pain Drives Change, which is a book about his own journey of domestic violence, alcohol abuse, and childhood trauma. We touch on a lot of deep, dark issues revolving around Damon's childhood, his upbringing, his relationship with his mother, his father, his wife, his ex-wife, and his children. His rock bottom came when he was separated from his wife and moved into a small house in the slums of Seattle, with no idea how much emotional pain he'd be facing in the years to come. Today, Damon is a very different person. He built a thriving small groups ministry as a volunteer at his church, and he leads men's ministry. He currently serves on the board of directors for one of the largest Christian junior football programs in Washington State. And it all started on January 13th, 1999, when he placed a video camera on a tripod and began video journaling the season of his life that transformed him into the man he is today. It's an episode you don't want to miss. Plus, as an added bonus, Damon wants to give a special gift to our SHAIR Podcast listeners. If you go to www.paindriveschange.com/SHAIR, SHAIR, Damon has created a special page where you can download and access free material on overcoming addiction and dysfunction in your family forever. So his free offer includes a 10-part email series, Overcoming Addiction and Dysfunction in Your Family Forever, the first chapter of his book, from the book Pain Drives Change, and practical goal setting. And this will be free to the first 50 people only. So again, if you love this episode and you would like to take advantage of this free offer, then either go to the SHAIR Podcast show notes, where that link will be featured on the show notes, or go to www.paindriveschange.com/SHAIR and get that free content now. So let's dive into Damon's story, but first, a little SHAIR Podcast news. Okay, guys, first of all, thanks so much for everyone who has helped support the SHAIR Podcast. And for those of you listening who would like to know how you can help support the SHAIR Podcast, let me give you a couple of ideas. First of all, the most important one, which is absolutely free, is to leave a rating and review on iTunes. iTunes single-handedly is one of the most powerful ways for people to find the SHAIR Podcast. So to make it easy for you guys, what I've done is I've put buttons on the website, www.theshairpodcast.com. Go there on the right-hand side. The very first button reads, subscribe on iTunes. Click on that button. It's going to send you directly to the iTunes podcast app. And from there, you'll click subscribe and then go to the section that says rate and review. And please leave us a 5-star rating. There's no question about it. iTunes is one of the best ways for our listeners to find the SHAIR Podcast, especially when they're searching for it on Google. If you don't have an iPhone, then go to Stitcher Radio. It's the banner right underneath the subscribe on iTunes. Click on that and do the exact same thing. Subscribe and then leave a 5-star rating and review. There's no question about it. This is the best way for you to show your support. I also want to thank all the listeners who have been clicking on the Amazon banner ad Folks, for those of you wondering what's another fantastic way to support the show is by clicking on that banner before you shop on Amazon. You're going to shop on Amazon anyway. It's not going to cost you 1 penny more, and it kicks back some commission to the SHAIR Podcast. We've already seen a dramatic increase in commission since we added the banner ad. So thanks again, guys. It's helping so much. And as far as being of service, you can also go to the website and click on the Join the Facebook Private Group banner. It'll take you right to the Facebook private group where you can request to be added and do some service. There's newcomers in there that are posting daily, old-timers sharing experience, strength, and hope. It's an absolutely beautiful way to contribute to your own recovery as well as to those in the community. So plug yourself in, get into that private Facebook group. It's absolutely thriving. And again, it's a wonderful way for everyone to be of service. And of course, I want to give a big thank you to all of the listeners who have continued to give donations every month. Thank you guys so much for your generous donations. And for those of you that would like to contribute and help grow and support the SHAIR Podcast financially, you can go to the website, click on the Donate with PayPal button, and it'll take you to the page where you can make your donation. And for those of you that use Sober Grid or are looking for an app on their phone where you can find meetings, have a sobriety calculator, connect privately with members of your local recovery community, or when you travel, connect with members in recovery in order to find a meeting, then you might as well join the private alumni group for SHAIR Podcast listeners. So go into the Sober Grid menu once you've registered. Scroll down to where it says Alumni Group, click on Add Group, and type in SHAIR, and the SHAIR Podcast Alumni Group will pop right up. And finally, I want to give credit to the SHAIR Podcast team that is instrumental in producing the SHAIR Podcast, Zinzi Gugu and Evelyn E., who handle the audio editing for each podcast episode, Omar Hernandez, that does all the social media cover art, and Krista Wojo, who handles all of our social media marketing. Without this amazing team, there's no way I could have continued to produce the podcast every week. Thank you, guys. I couldn't do this without you. So now a quick message from our sponsor and on to the show. Sober Nation is the largest online recovery community and treatment resource center. They provide treatment resources to those struggling with addiction, as well as to the family members who are caught in the crossfire. On top of that, Sober Nation is a huge community of good people who share their experience with each other. They have informative content, recovery and addiction news, as well as an entire clothing line which helps expand the culture of recovery. They can easily be found at www.sobernation.com. Sober Nation is putting recovery on the map. And finally, would you like to receive the most popular AA daily devotions free in one distribution? Transitions Daily delivers daily devotions from the 24 hours a day, AA Thought for the Day, Daily Reflections, Big Book Quote, Just for Today, As Bill Sees It, plus more. You can get our distribution daily via email, private Facebook group, or Twitter. Go to dailyaaemails.com for more information. And don't forget to share dailyaaemails.com with friends in meetings and with sponsees in recovery. Now back to the show. Hey, Damon, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Omar, thanks for having me on. I'm pretty excited to be here today.
I'm super excited to have you on the show, buddy. So, folks, today we have Damon Stoddard joining us on the SHAIR Podcast. Damon is the author of Pain Drives Change. So, Damon, let's dive right in, buddy. Tell us a little bit about, first of all, how your life is today. Give us your normal daily routine.
Yeah, I think that I have a favorite quote, Omar. It's your system is perfectly designed to give you the results that you're getting. And what I've done with my life is I've got a lot of predictability in my life. I get up kind of the same time in the morning. I exercise. I spend time with God, spend time with my wife. I work at Microsoft my second time around. I've been here 13 years.
Wow.
And then I go home and I enjoy the dream that I always never dreamed was possible with my family, my two younger kids, my daughter and my older stepdaughter. Pretty fantastic life, honestly. Loving it.
I love the family life, man. It's just the predictability. We were just talking about that. It brings so much peace into our lives.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you also mentioned, one of the first things you mentioned was spend time with God. And one of my questions is, do you maintain your spiritual condition, that conscious contact with a higher power?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, I'm Christian, so I have a church that I go to every week. My wife is Christian. We've been married nearly 12 years. We try to pray every day together. We came across a statistic a long time ago that says that couples that pray together, the chances of divorce are less than 1 in 1,000, whereas normal couples, it's 1 in 2. So we make that a high priority in our lives. I also pray in the mornings, read my Bible quite regularly, and I'm probably a biggest piece of this is fellowship. I'm involved with a men's group. We meet every couple of weeks on Skype, and we hold each other very, very accountable to living balanced lives. And we call each other out when things aren't working right.
I love it. I love it. So the statistic, again, you're saying that statistically, if a couple prays together on a daily basis, their chance of divorce is 1% or less than 1%?
It's less than 1 in 1,000, 0.1%.
Oh my God. So even, less than 1. That is, listeners, that is food for thought. I'm bringing this up to my wife tonight.
Yeah. And the other piece about that is that my wife and I are in our second marriage, and the divorce rate for second marriages with children is nearly 70%. I like to think that our prayer life and our shared spiritual life, common values, common dreams, are a big piece of why we're successful.
Man, that is just wonderful. Okay, so you guys have both already been married and divorced one time.
Yes, that's correct. Yep.
Okay, all right. I didn't know that. Not for nothing, but, or maybe it's because I'm married a second time too. They say that the second time around is the one. Right? Like once you get the trial marriage out of the way, then the second marriage is the one that you've learned all your mistakes from, or is that not?
Yeah, my a lot of my story is about my first marriage and the problems that we had and all of the things that I tried to do to overcome it. And after that marriage failed, I remember thinking of that quote that I just shared with you. Your system is perfectly designed to give you the results that you're getting. And I thought, my system has really done a good job of producing terrible relationships and a terrible marriage. I think maybe I want to change my system.
Right.
So I tried something completely different. I actually talk about that in the book, but I tried something completely different and found the most incredible woman and couldn't be happier.
Okay, well, I wanted you to make sure to go in depth about that. So let's actually, Damon, and listeners, we're going to be doing this particular interview a little bit different. Damon's given me a little bit of feedback on, where he's at as far as his own issues. And they weren't so much with recovering from drugs and alcohol as it been from more of emotional trauma and other forms of addiction. So Damon can tell it better. So Damon, tell us a little bit about your story.
Yeah. So interestingly enough, Omar, I just a couple of weeks ago was my mom's funeral, and I got to do her funeral service, and I retold her story, which is a lot of my story, through that funeral service, and it just made me realize how blessed I was to have her as my mom. And a lot of the story is actually about my mom, but I'll kind of go back. It was September 27th, 1997, one of the best days of my life. My first daughter, Monica, was born. Couldn't be happier. I think, like everybody, we all want to have children. We all want to be happily married, and we want to remain married the first time.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, less than a month later was probably the worst day of my life. It was one of those days where I was kind of edgy, very argumentative mood. I'm not quite sure why, but I was just kind of trying to pick a fight. And I found a fight. My wife and I got into an argument. Really, I don't even think it was about anything. I think we'd gone to Costco that day, and I was mad because she bought Twinkies or something, just something stupid. But this was an ugly fight.
Right.
It escalated very quickly into yelling and screaming. My two stepdaughters stood by helplessly, watching and listening, but it didn't get any better. It only got worse. My wife, to protect herself, she grabbed our baby Monica, who was just a month old. And immediately when my wife grabbed my daughter, I had flashbacks of being a little boy. And when I was a little boy, I was abandoned multiple times for my own mom being too drunk to take care of me. that same level of abandonment overwhelmed me, and I struck my wife with a closed fist in an attempt to keep her from abandoning me, hard enough to knock her out for a minute. A few minutes later, I was sitting in the back of a police car, and I was abandoning my family just like I was abandoned as a child. Pretty ugly.
Man, that is
one of the most shameful days of my life.
Wow. So what happened next?
Yeah, so I remember sitting in the jail cell because they had to bring me to jail, and I was angry. I was just steaming mad, thinking, how could this woman send me to jail? It's all her fault. I took no responsibility whatsoever for my actions, and I blamed her for my sin. Unfortunately, against the advice of the domestic violence counselor, she bailed me out. And, I hated myself for what I'd done, but I couldn't stop. Over the next couple of years, a couple more incidents happened, and my court-ordered domestic violence classes weren't helping a bit. In fact, it kind of felt like they were making things worse. So I had this voice in my head that said, "You're a monster, you'll never change." One of my good friends said, "You when you walk around, you hunch your shoulders and you look like Gumby. You have no spine." And I didn't. I hated myself, and I couldn't stop. I think a lot of the listeners will understand that when you're trying to stop and you just can't.
Right. So how did you stop?
Well, so I remember it very, very clearly. I live in Seattle, and it was raining very, very hard. And on January 8th, 1999, my wife and I separated. I packed my 4Runner up with my clothes and a few belongings, and I watched as my 15-month-old daughter waved goodbye in the window. Tears filled her brown eyes, and I was abandoning her just exactly like I swore I'd never do. I ended up moving into a little house in the slums of South Seattle. Dark, depressed. I was completely depressed, feeling hopeless. Every time I'd see or talk to my wife and daughters, they'd call me a monster, and I'd feel even worse. I remember going down there and trying to avoid the pain. The only way that I could do that was to go to sleep. And even sleep didn't help because I'd wake up and I'd be in tears. Extreme pain. But, God knew what he was doing. And pain drives change. My pain was so great that the pain of staying the same was greater than the pain of change. And because of that, my motivation to change was automatic. 5 days later, I took a video camera, a Hi8 video camera, and I put it on a tripod. And I started videotaping myself, kind of a video journal, talking about my experiences and all of the things that were going on. And I continued to journal with that video camera for about the next 4 months. And I recently before I wrote the book, I was watching that video. And in one of the videos, I said, I don't know how it's going to happen, but I swear I'm going to use my pain and use my experiences to help other people that are in this situation live a better life. And I think maybe that's where the book came from.
Right. So you had all these experiences, and there's a lot of broad strokes.
There's a lot of broad strokes.
And there was, the things that it took for you to get to this point. What kind of things did you experience as a child growing up, with your mom, who was an alcoholic? What our listeners want to know is what was it like, and what did you do to get through that tough childhood, especially those times, during grade school and high school?
That's a great question. I'll try and answer it succinctly, but I'm not sure if I'll be able to. I remember when I was 3 or 4 years old, I woke up one night and I heard plates and china being thrown across the room. And I woke up and I saw my mom throwing this china and plates at my stepfather. They fought an awful lot. Here was another example of that. And I was terrified. The very person that was supposed to take care of me was abandoning me through her alcoholism. And I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. My older sister, Deb, saw it as well, and she had been going to church, and she prayed, "Jesus, please help us." And I remember in an instant, I kid you not, my mom passed out, and there was complete calm in the home.
Wow.
Unfortunately, that wasn't the only time that happened.
Uh-huh.
There were multiple times that I can remember when my mom was in angry rage, drunken angry rage. She would she would get taken away in an ambulance in a straitjacket. Many, many, many times. It was pretty severe. When I was, and actually you'd ask the question, how did I handle it? God put some families in our lives, our neighbors. When my mom would go away, the neighbors would take care of us. And I remember the neighbors loved us, and they taught me about Jesus, honestly, as a little boy. And I think that knowledge sort of is what showed my sister how to pray. And that knowledge is ultimately what ended up getting me where I am today. But when I was 8 years old, my mom had finally decided that she wanted to change. So we moved to a little house in Eastern Washington, or we moved to a basement apartment in Eastern Washington. My mom had gone there to be with some people in AA in their basement. And one day I came home from school and my mom was standing there and the door was locked. We couldn't get into our home. For some reason, they had locked the door and we couldn't get in. So my mom had to make a very, very hard decision. After a couple of days of living in a park, we ended up walking down to a social worker's office, met a lady by the name of Meredith Kerr, and she said that we're going to have to all go to foster homes. We're going to all go to different foster homes. I ended up going to a foster home. Turns out that the second foster home I went to was a boys' ranch, and my foster dad sexually abused me during that time. I didn't know it was a problem. He tried to convince me it was fine, but it wasn't fine.
Of course
Wasn't
not.
until I was in 7th grade that the FBI came knocking on the door and said, do you know this guy? I said, yeah. Well, we're looking for him. It turns out he's done this to 20, 25 little boys.
Oh, man.
Yeah. Kind of intense, buddy.
Oh, yeah, no.
Yeah. Kind of intense.
How long did you live there?
I lived there for nearly 2 years.
And how many boys were living at the house during that time?
Maybe 15 to 20 boys.
Oh, wow. And was this happening to all of them?
I think it was only happening to the ones that he called special. He used to say, you're the apple of my eye. He knew that my dad was out of the picture, and he manipulated the situation to get me to like him even more. I needed a father in my life, and he played that role. He was a predator.
No question about it. And I'm assuming that, especially back in that time, the need for foster care and not only that, they get paid, right? They get paid per child.
Yeah.
So it's a business.
And in fact, what's interesting is after I wrote the book, my wife and I were talking about this chapter of my life, and I didn't know if I was going to write about this stuff or not. It just kind of came out. And she said, have you ever found him? And I said, no, I never did. And then I did a Google search, and I found a newspaper article from 1978 that talked about him. And this newspaper article painted him out to be a saint.
Wow.
Yeah. I felt sick to my stomach when I saw it.
There's so much, and recently, I don't know if you saw the movie Spotlight.
No, I haven't.
It's another horrifying look at the Catholic Church and priests and all the cover-ups that went on for years. And I can't remember where it was. It might have been in Boston when this happened. And also, there was another movie that was about these boys went to a boys' home because they did some illegal stuff, but they were kids. They were just children, and they were sent away to a boys' home. Same thing happened to them. I think it was probably something that was very prevalent, more so and harder to either deal with, as maybe society in general doesn't want to touch a subject like this. It's so embarrassing. It's so delicate. Anyone that gets tagged with this, their life is ruined. If you get tagged as a pedophile, your life is, you're done, right? But I think recently this is the kind of thing that would come out into the light a lot quicker in today's society. Do you? I know we're getting a little off topic.
Well, that's okay. You know what? Let's just take this where it needs to go.
Yeah. Do you find that today that children that are in foster care, that there's a better system for making sure that these things don't happen to children?
That's a great question. I haven't evaluated it. I haven't checked it out. But what I will say is that they're your children. And, life is going to get tough, but they're your children. And you got to make absolutely certain that you trust the people that are taking care of them.
Yeah.
I mean, in this particular case, this particular individual was so manipulative that he had my mom actually worked for him. And after my mom stopped working for him, he used to drive 2 hours to pick me up on weekends. He would take me to Disneyland and Disney World and trips around the country, and he'd buy me presents at Christmas, because I didn't get presents at Christmas from my dad. And it's just awful. I mean, I thought it was great. It's all I knew as a father. He convinced me that what he was doing to me was normal. He used to say, "This is what fathers do." I didn't know any different.
He had it down. He had the system down. He knew exactly what to say and exactly what to do. And how old were you when you finally got away from him?
I was hitting puberty, 11 or 12 years old, and I knew something wasn't right.
Right.
And it was when I was in 7th grade that it finally ended. And that was kind of the last time I heard or saw him.
Did drugs or alcohol or something else? What was the coping mechanism that you used once it hit you about what was happening or what had happened?
Yeah, I think that my coping mechanism was just a little bit different. I was what they call the superstar or the superhero. So I ended up seeking out my own father's affection through my accomplishments, through my good grades and being good in sports. And I constantly tried to earn my own father's affection through doing those kinds of things.
Okay.
Of course, it never worked, but that's what I tried to do.
And you mentioned that your mother is an alcoholic, and this was going on. And your father, when did your father take off?
So my mom and dad divorced when I was about 3 years old.
Okay.
And, I got to give my dad a lot of credit. My mom had a lot of problems. She had a lot of problems. He hung in there for a long time. But eventually, it was so painful that he had 5 kids and he didn't know what to do.
Right.
So he ended up kind of starting his own life. And it took a number of years, until I was 31 years old, to actually deal with that. And I'll talk about that in just a little while.
Okay. And so when did for example, you got through high school,
Yep.
right? And the next stage and how old were you the first time you got married?
I think I was 27, 28 years old, something like that.
So there's about a 10-year span of time before you got married. What was going on during that period of time? Because you talk a little bit about your love addiction.
Yeah.
Did that start to evolve during that period of time?
Yeah. So once again, the void I was trying to fill was I needed my father's affection. And the way that I tried to do that was through the affection of women.
Correct.
And so I would date women and I would get very, very close to them and they would start pushing me away. And when they would start pushing me away, I was feeling like I was being abandoned again, like I was as a little boy. Mm-hmm. And that would make me closer to them. And honestly, my first love, I ended up abusing her, ended up going to jail, and did the same thing to a number of different girlfriends over the years. And it was always the same thing. It was always a great euphoric relationship in the beginning. But when things didn't work out and they started abandoning me, I would draw closer and things would happen. So
I don't suppose you want to elaborate on how bad it got, just to give an idea?
I think it got the worst with my wife. So we were dating, mm-hmm. and I think the first time that it happened, we'd been dating for 4 or 5 months, and we got into a fight after a Christmas party. and I ended up, you know, she ended up making me angry. We're driving in the car and ended up hitting her on the side of the face with a closed fist. Really, really not proud of this stuff.
No,
I gotta tell you, you're just digging it out, aren't you, bud?
Well, the thing is that there's so much. I mean, the pain drives change.
Yeah.
And the book in and of itself, the title suggests that not only were you in a tremendous amount of pain, but we typically will put those around us, the closest people around us, through an enormous amount of pain.
Good. Yeah. I think that's a really good observation. Right on. Yeah.
And so it's so important, especially, I mean, and that's one of the reasons why I feel that the success of the podcast has been is just, you know, that idea of being open to vulnerability, and that what you went through, that the pain and the challenges that you went through and then overcame is not only the power of example, but it also is relatable. Yeah. You know, there's guys out there that are right now early in recovery and are dealing with these issues, right? And and you know, that may be physically abusive to their partner, right? And they have to know that there's a way out of this. And not only is there a way out of this, there's a reason why you're doing it. And it has nothing to do with, you know, being the man.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I appreciate you sharing that. When I sat down to write the book, I didn't even know that I was going to talk about my problems with domestic violence. It was kind of a secret that very few people knew. And when I started writing the book, it just became so obvious that I had to write about it. And I heard a statistic one time, and I'll get it wrong just recently, but domestic violence is rampant. It is a rampant problem. And I think that my story and the way that I've overcome it is a story that people that struggle with this need to hear. I really do.
I agree 100%. So that's why we're going there.
Yeah.
You know, I can tell you're uncomfortable, and I can tell that
I appreciate it, man. I love that you're pulling this out. You're good at what you do.
Well, thank you.
Doing this a while.
I've been doing this, you know, not that long, but long enough to be able to identify that, you know, where's that stuff? There's that stuff in there, and there's these experiences that we've had, the story that we have behind it. And so, how long were you married the first time?
2.5 years before we separated, and all said and done, it was I think we were married 4 years.
So married 2.5 years. Oh, and this current marriage is 4 years.
No, this current marriage is 12 years. Yeah. In my first marriage, we were separated after 2.5 years.
Got it.
After 4 years. Yeah.
Got it. Okay, so you were technically married for 4 years, but you were together for 2.5.
Yeah. Yep.
A lot happens in 2.5 years. And how many kids did you guys have?
We only had one. We had my daughter Monica.
Okay, and during that time period, what was going on with Monica?
Boy, what was going on with Monica is she was a little girl, a little baby girl, the apple of my eye, the one that I swore I would never, ever, ever put through what I went through.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, the one that ended up going through pretty much everything that I went through.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Well, I'm assuming that she witnessed the violence.
You know, she was only 1.5 years old by the time that we separated.
Mm-hmm.
So she's not old enough to remember much of any of it. My first wife's older daughters experienced every single bit of it, however. Every bit of it.
What were those? Were there consequences for that? Like, what did your stepdaughters ever call the police? Was there ever a situation?
Yeah, they ended up calling the police multiple times. They ended up watching it. And they actually ended up, they've watched me over the years and watched how I've changed. They both got a chance to read my book and sent me emails just thanking me for how honest I was, and say it brought back a lot of painful memories and told me how proud they were of me and those kinds of things. So I'm hoping that my recovery can play a role in their lives. That's pretty powerful. Yeah.
that, I mean, that's the end result that we would all want, because being human beings, that's what we are. We're human beings we're spiritual beings having a human experience.
Yeah.
And, no one's perfect. There's no roadmap to being a father, being a husband. And when these things happen to us, how we cope with them is anyone's guess. And in many cases, it's, utterly deplorable and dysfunctional. But to get to a point where they would be proud of you for what you've done and what you've accomplished, and recognizing that, a lot of changes happened. So then you talk here about a 5-year period of time where there was a lot of pain.
Yeah.
Walk us through these moments, these next 5 years.
Yeah. So, it literally started when we separated, and I was living in that house in South Seattle. And, I was a Christian at the time, but at that point in time, I fully submitted my life to Christ. I was on my knees every day crying out to God, take me out of this pain, take me out of this pain. And of course, he didn't alleviate the pain immediately, because if he had, I would have never changed. But he put a lot of things in my life that got me there. Probably one of the first things I remember is I came across this scripture in the book of James. James 1:2-4 says, "Consider it joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing the testing of your faith produces endurance." I had known that scripture, but I didn't know the second part of it that said, knowing the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its perfect result, so that you'll be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. And when I saw that scripture, I thought, you know what? There's a purpose for my pain. There's a purpose for pain. He's trying to grow me into the person he wants me to be, and I've got to find joy in this somehow. Now, I can't say that during that time I was jumping up and down with joy and saying wahoo, but at least I knew that something was happening, that that he was working on me, and this is what it took to work on me. So, God put a couple of guys in my life. It turns out that he put those guys in my life the day that I started working as an intern about 10 years earlier. One of those guys had a Bible on his table, and he interviewed me and hired me for the job, my first job. Another guy I worked with as an engineer, and I was ashamed of myself. I mean, abusing my wife, not being able to stop, I was ashamed of myself, and I held this thing deep inside. I couldn't tell anybody, because if I told people, they just wouldn't. I might lose my job. But it was so painful that one day I asked my friend Bob, I said, "Hey, Bob, can we talk?" And he said, "Sure." And I said, "Bob, I've got something to tell you." And Bob was a very, very strong Christian man with a family of 8. He homeschooled his kids, and I could see he was trustworthy.
Wow.
Watched him over 10 years. Over 10 years, I saw it. And I said, "Hey, Bob, I'm separated from my wife." And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "There's more. I'm separated from her because I've abused her, and I can't stop." And I watched his eyes to see if he was going to judge me, and he didn't even flinch. He just said, "It's by the grace of God that I've not done the same to my wife. Thanks for sharing." And there is power in confession. Yeah. The Bible says, "Confess your sins one to another that you may be healed." And it was through my confession that a lot of the toxicity started leaving my body. And the same thing happened with Steve. Had a conversation with him, the same story. "Steve, I've got something to tell you. Separated from my wife." He said, "Yeah." And I said, "I've abused her, and I can't stop." He said, "Thanks for sharing, Damon. I appreciate it." He didn't flinch. He didn't judge me. He didn't do anything. And that confession had enormous power. These guys literally carried me for the next couple of months. They were there. I ended up living with Steve and his wife for 3 months in a little unfinished room in his garage. I ended up living in my motorhome in Bob's backyard for 3 months. And these guys mentored me and coached me and encouraged me and lifted me up, and they disciplined me and they loved me. And I wouldn't be where I am today without these guys. I talk about that in the first chapter of my book called "The Pain of Being Alone." And you know what? We can't be alone. We got to have people like this in our life.
Yes.
But there was more. There was a lot more. So it turns out that my marriage counselor at the time, thought that I might be bipolar. And so he recommended going to my primary care physician. So I sat down with my primary care physician and I said, I've been abusing my wife and I can't stop. And he says, do you know what cyclothymia is? And I said, no, I don't. He says, well, it turns out it's pretty common that people with cyclothymia, which is mild bipolar, struggle with abuse. And he said, what ends up happening is the bipolar brain doesn't have this chemical that puts a pause between stimulus and response. And so a lot of times in an argument, what'll end up happening is you'll get angry and you don't have that microsecond to pause and you'll just react. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, is this why I'm hitting my wife and I can't stop? Wow, this is incredible. Absolutely incredible. And so he said there's a medication called Depakote, and they give it to epileptics. And if you start taking the Depakote, I bet you're going to find a change. I started taking Depakote, and I haven't had an incident of abuse since 1998.
Wow.
Not one time.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Doesn't it just... It's so difficult to listen to, and inherently, as you listen to the story, you start to picture what it was like in the home and what the argument could escalate to, and all these things that could have been avoided.
Yeah.
And we know because of the medication, but we also know that living in a home where there is alcoholism, where there is abuse, those are also going to lead to all these things. These are all either learned behaviors or adapted behaviors to protect ourselves.
Yep, absolutely.
And, I want to ask you, what kind of advice you would give to our listeners. But real quick, I'm wondering, when the light bulb went on, when you realized that you were being sexually abused, was there a moment where like rage took over, where thoughts of finding this person, where you wanted to get revenge, where you wanted to inflict bodily damage on this person?
It's a great question, Omar, and I'll be 100% honest with you. I did not. And here's why. This man started when I was 8 years old. I had grown up, and I had a big void in my heart, and he knew how to fill it. He convinced me that what he was doing was right. He convinced me that what I was doing was normal, and this is what dads do to their sons. Mm-hmm. He absolutely convinced me. I didn't feel anger or rage or anything for him until after I wrote the book and I pulled up that article. And in that article where it made him out to be a saint, I started getting angry.
Right.
And I decided, you know what, I want to find this guy. Not for revenge, because vengeance isn't mine.
Right.
But I want to find him, and I want to look him in the eye. I want to talk to him. And I want to tell him that that I forgive him. Because it does me no good.
Wow.
To carry that around.
That's powerful.
Yeah.
That's
no
powerful. Good. You don't feel then that in any way that in particular incident was not the catalyst then that was in any way, shape, or form the driving force behind the abuse, the physical abuse on your wife?
I don't think so. I think that the catalyst was the abandonment that I'd experienced as a child, the emotional abandonment.
So
and the fact that I grew up, and this is my own theory, but I think that boys need somebody that's going to tell them no and hold the line.
Yeah.
And nobody ever told me no, and nobody ever held the line with me.
Got it.
And so I had to kind of be my own boss, my own God.
Right. And what about we'll go into your relationship with your mother today, but at the time, could this have been also an issue? Were you angry and enraged at your mother at the time?
No, I wasn't. I had a pretty good relationship with my mom.
Always.
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
But my dad, I had a lot of anger and rage towards my dad.
Okay.
A lot of anger and rage towards my dad. And I think that a big piece of this was that anger and rage coming out.
It makes sense. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So then let's move into that part then. Let's talk about, how we can help our listeners. What advice do you have for our listeners?
Yeah, so let me give you that advice in a couple of the next steps. So first one is this relationship with my dad, the father void. It turns out that I looked up some statistics, and it turns out that people or children that grew up from fatherless homes are 10 times more likely to abuse chemical substances. And it turns out that 71% of adolescent substance abusers come from fatherless homes. I came from a fatherless home. And when my pain was so great and I was separated from my wife, I remember thinking, I need my dad. I'm alone. I need my dad. And I called my dad. And I said, Dad, my counselor said that he would facilitate a counseling session with us. I need to deal with my anger towards you. Will you come over and go to counseling? And he said, yeah, I'll come over and go to counseling. We ended up going to a counseling session, and I ended up listening to his story. And he told me about how all he ever wanted was a family. And he told me about all of the problems that were going on in the marriage and how he tried to hold on and eventually he couldn't. And he told me that he regretted everything he'd done, leaving the family and not being there. And then he said 4 words that changed my life forever. He said, will you forgive me? And in that instant, when he said, will you forgive me, it was like with a pressure cooker, there's the thing on the top that's just going off.
Uh-huh.
It was like somebody took that pressure cooker, that lid, and went, and all of that pressure was relieved. Changed my life forever, unquestionably. So my advice, there's one of a lot of advice, but my advice to the listeners is, if you don't have a strong, loving relationship with your dad, do everything in your power to get one. It'll change your life.
Man.
Yeah.
Yeah. I could definitely relate and create an entire segment just from that question. And a big part of my story, whenever I'm asked to tell my story, a big part of it is my disconnect and reconnect to my father.
It's awesome. When my counselor, the counselor gave us some homework after we left that day. He said, what I want you guys to do, it's going to be awkward, but every time you see each other, I want you to end the conversation with saying, I love you. Every time. It'll be awkward at first, but keep doing it. And my dad and I have an incredible relationship today. Absolutely incredible relationship. We talk to each other on the phone. We visit him 3 times a year. We're going on a trip to Alaska in a couple of weeks. It was one of his dreams before he dies. Always say I love you before we hang up. Always.
That is such an important. It's such a small thing, and it's so massive all at the same time. It allows you to have closure on every single phone call.
Yeah, it does. I don't think that we fully understand the impact that our fathers had on us and the impact as fathers that we have on our kids. But I think it's one of the primary things that needs to happen in order to kind of recover and have the life that you really want to have.
No question about it. So let's go through all the steps.
Yeah. So basically, as I thought about my book, and I wrote the book as a story, and then I kind of took a step back and said, what's the process here that I went through, and could I share this process with your listeners? And I've already kind of talked about the first ones, but the first one is face your pain head on, and if you imagine taking your hand and putting it on a hot stove, right? What happens when you put your hand on a hot stove? You don't sit there and think, ouch, that's hot. Maybe I should pull my hand away. It smells like burning flesh.
Right.
You don't even have to think about it. It happens automatically. It pulls back automatically.
Correct.
And that's what's so awesome about pain. When we're in pain, change is going to happen automatically. It's guaranteed. So if you're in pain, use it as the catalyst to make the changes that you know you need to make. Find joy in the pain and use it as a catalyst. Absolutely. That's the whole premise of my book. The second one here, faith in God. I think it's pretty clear to the listeners that I've got a very strong faith, and I think it's core, foundational. I talked about friends, the role of Bob and Steve in my life. Read a book by a guy named Patrick Means. He talks about a study that says fewer than 1 in 4 men have another man they could call a true friend. And I think that if you don't have somebody like that in your life, you have to have somebody like that in your life. It was through my confession that I was healed. The next step is find the root cause. I talked about my diagnosis of bipolar, and I was doing some research before our call. And I came across this study by the Canadian Journal of Psychiatry that said that people with substance use problems are up to 3 times more likely to have a mental illness. What's interesting about that is having a mental illness does not make you a bad person. That's just the hand God dealt you.
Correct.
Right? And if you think there might be something going on, for me, in my domestic violence classes, I thought there might be something going on. I talked to my domestic violence counselor. I said, I think I might be bipolar. He looked at me and he said, you're just trying to make an excuse for why you're doing this stuff. Year and a half later, I ended up going to a different doctor and a different counselor, and they said, you've got bipolar. They gave me medicine, and I never abused again. If you think that there's any possibility that you might be struggling with mental illness, it's not bad that you do. Get help, take your medication, and I think that you're going to find that it helps you across the board. Another one, I didn't get a chance to share this, but the Bible says, without a vision, the people perish. And on February 28th, 1999, I was severely depressed. It was about 2 months after being separated. I ended up writing a dream for my future. And this dream was a dream that I never thought possible. It was a dream of a family and children. And it said, I have a 100-year-old shade tree in my yard. Literally, the life that I have today is exactly what I wrote down in 1999. Exactly. I've got a maple tree that's huge that sits in my yard. Absolutely huge. I'm convinced that writing that dream out and having that dream is what pulled me out of the muck and the mire. What pulled me out of getting stuck in that muck. It pulled me out and it helped me have the life that I have today.
Well, you manifested it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And then I talked a bit about family of origin stuff, but I want to just mention that again. I came across a book called Love is a Choice. Fantastic book. I'd recommend it to anybody. But they had a picture in there of kind of what the root of a lot of addiction is.
Mm-hmm.
And basically what the picture showed is, if you think about your grandparents having an unhealthy relationship, their heart tanks are kind of empty. And when they had their child or your mom or your dad, instead of pouring love into that child, they pulled love out of that child. And that child ended up having a void as well. And we know that when you got a void and you're looking for a spouse, you look across the room and you find somebody else has got a void. And guess what? You get married, you have a kid, and the same thing happens. The Bible says the sins of the fathers are passed down to the 3rd and the 4th generations.
Mm-hmm.
And when I saw that picture, I thought to myself, oh, I had a pretty big void as a child. I probably better work on healing that void. And I went through 12 steps and the Love is Addiction workbook. I had an addiction counselor. I spent years of counseling working on this stuff and kind of bringing it to healing. And then there's a couple more. One that I want to mention, it's going to sound kind of strange, Omar, but it's family rituals. So that same counselor that I talked about earlier, she talked to me about a book called An Elephant in the Living Room. Yeah.
I know where this is going.
Yeah, An Elephant in the Living Room, a leader's guide for helping children of alcoholics. And the book talked about a study that was done where they looked at adult children of alcoholics. And what they found is when these adult children, when they were children and they had rituals or traditions in the lives of the family, that they were much less likely to produce children that would grow up to be alcoholics. In fact, they found that the greater the change in family rituals during the time of heaviest drinking, the more likely the recurrence of alcoholism in the children's generation. Simple things like family rituals, like having dinner with your family 4 to 5 times a week, celebrating birthdays consistently, holidays, daily routines, going to church, camping together, those types of things have a profoundly huge impact and have had a huge impact on me and my kids in terms of stopping this stuff forever.
And fellowship, right?
Yeah, fellowship. So my friend Bob, way back in the day, he said, Damon, if you want to know the person you're going to be in 5 years, it's pretty simple. Just look at the books that you read and look at the people that you spend time with. I thought that's pretty profound. So he said, what you want to do is you want to find people that have the life that you want. Well, he was one of those people. He's one of my best friends today. And I remember I went over to his house one day, and he had 8 kids. And I remember we sat at the dinner table, and they served dinner, and they prayed and had dinner. And I'm like, this is weird. They're not fighting. They're not arguing. They're just happy. And it took me like 4 or 5 different times of having dinner with his family to realize that was kind of just what healthy families do. And by spending time with him and seeing that, it kind of gave me a vision for what I wanted.
Right.
Right?
There's no question about it.
I think it's really important, really, really important to find the people that have the life that you want, not the life that you're trying to leave, but the life that you want, and intentionally spend lots of time with them. Develop relationships with them.
Absolutely. I wanted you to run through those because I'm staring at the list. So, I want to hear your feedback on it. And of course, our listeners, want a little bit of a trailer, so to speak, for each one of those sections.
Yeah.
But if you pay close attention, and I think when you talk about core values, when you talk about what we deal with in our own program, which step work, when you deal with religion and they have spiritual principles or a spiritual foundation, basic 10 commandments, so to speak, there's such a parallel when you're getting healthy and you're connecting not only with yourself, but with your higher self. What we talk about in the fellowship, having a faith in God, developing a relationship with God or with a higher power, the friendships that you talk about, the ones where you could lean on Bob and talk to him and say, I did these things. And you wait and you look across the table for them to judge you, and you realize that they don't even flinch.
Yeah.
It's no different than when a sponsor is dealing with a sponsee. When I'm looking across the table at a sponsee and they say something to me or I'm reading their step work, there's never a moment where there is anything but just genuine care, concern, and objectivity when you're dealing with these situations. They need to know that they're in a safe environment at all times, and that's what that for me encompasses fellowship, friendship, and finding out these root causes is the most important part of what we do in the step work. That's the 4th step, where we discover what happened to you that you use so much drugs and alcohol to overcome, or not even overcome, just camouflage and
kill the pain.
Kill the pain. That's what you're trying to do. You're just trying to dull yourself out and kill the pain. And I love what this whole focus on the future, where we don't talk enough about that in the fellowship, because we talk a lot about a Just for Today program. But it's so important to have goals and visions and dreams. I am a firm believer that what you perceive, you achieve, and when you focus so much energy and intention and align yourself with that, you will draw it to you. The same way you find healthy living, the same way you attracted the book, that came out of you. It was just you were seeking to relieve yourself, to purge yourself from so much pain, so much dysfunction, that it just, like you said, I didn't plan on putting all this stuff down, but it just did. Yeah. So real quick, knowing that our listeners can get a lot from this book because it's a memoir, but it's also an instruction manual. Yeah. And it's very basic and easy to read, and it's something that definitely our listeners need. They want something that's very palatable and is not too technical. But one of the things that I was curious about, because you've mentioned it kind of generally, but you haven't gone into it too much, is these domestic violence classes.
Yeah.
How long? Well, first of all, when did you start taking them? For how long have you been taking them, and are you still taking them?
Yeah, so the domestic violence classes were court ordered. It was 1997 when I started taking them, and it was near the middle of 1999 when I stopped taking them. What I found with the domestic violence classes is because they were required, the people weren't necessarily there. Most of the people weren't necessarily there to get healthy.
Right.
They were just there to, quote, do their time.
Uh-huh.
They didn't end up helping me an awful lot, to be quite frank with you. It was the relationship with Bob, and what was interesting is when Bob said, DV doesn't stand for domestic violence anymore, Damon. It stands for Dream and a Vision. And it was when I started, instead of focusing on today and all the things I'd done wrong today, which is what I experienced in those classes, and I started focusing on the future, is when I really started changing. My life dramatically improved from that point on.
Which is something that you still participate in today, correct?
Yeah, I'm in a men's group. We meet every couple weeks, and I've got a lot of men in my life. I mean, Bob and I took a bike ride last week. I have a lot of men in my life that I call and talk to when things are wrong. I go to church very, very regularly, pretty active in small groups on a regular basis. Have a very strong circle of friends. We camp together. Our kids are the same ages. Very surrounded with a support system.
Beautiful. And you've been married now for 12 years.
Yeah, 12 years in June.
How is your relationship with your ex-wife today? Do you have a relationship with your ex-wife?
I stay in touch with her very infrequently. My daughter, Monica, is 18 years old now. And when Monica was growing up, I ended up getting custody of her when she was 5 years old.
How did you end up with custody of her? We missed a lot. We missed a lot, Damon.
This could be the Guinness Book of World Record longest podcast ever.
You don't listen to the Rich Roll podcast, do you? Those are 2 hours.
Yeah. So how did I end up getting custody of Monica? It was Monica's first day of kindergarten, and her mom and I brought her to kindergarten together. And she was living with her mom, and her mom was supposed to pick her up at the end of the day. And I called, and she hadn't picked her up. Her older sister went and picked her up. And a couple hours later, I called, and her mom still wasn't home. So I drove up to pick her up. And just to protect my ex-wife, I'm not going to talk about what happened.
Okay.
But I'll just say that I believe it was a miracle. And the next day, I had temporary custody of my daughter.
So there was such dramatic change in you.
Yes.
Because what we talk about here, as far as dysfunction, seeking dysfunction, you and your wife, your first wife, seeking each other out to fill the void within the other, which is impossible to do.
It sure was.
But in the course of this time, you went looking for help, and it doesn't sound like she did.
I think that she did on and off.
Okay.
And I think that she sought help for a short period of time, and when things got easy, she stopped pursuing that same path. And I think when you stop pursuing that path is when you kind of stop making the gains that you'd made.
Yeah,
what I tell Monica is, my life isn't the life I have today isn't because of one big decision. It's because of small, good decisions every single day. Every single day.
I love it. So you got full custody of your daughter. She's 18 years old. Does she have a relationship with her mother?
She does have a relationship with her mom. I'll take just a minute and share Monica's story because I think it's pretty relevant to a lot of people. So I did everything in my power, having custody of Monica, to make sure that she didn't go through what I went through. I was the best dad I could be. I did everything to make sure that she wouldn't have the problems. But unfortunately, when Monica was 12, 13 years old, guess what she started doing?
Drugs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Drugs. And she kind of liked them. Was court ordered to go to a class. And remember, we went to a class, and the class had a video of a cat that was stoned on marijuana. And I'm like, why did they do that? She ended up telling me afterwards that that made her curious. So she started smoking dope every day, started running away, stopped going to school. Things got worse and worse and worse until one day I discovered that, she couldn't hide from me anymore. She went to treatment for 28 days. And after treatment, she ended up going to a 3 or 4 month program. And I thought her life was going to be in order. A couple months later, she started running with the same friends, and things got worse.
Mm-hmm.
Stopped going to school. I ended up getting it's called a at-risk youth petition, where literally I go to the law to help me control my daughter.
Right.
She ended up running away, ended up going to juvenile. After she got out of juvenile, she said she wasn't coming home. She went and stayed with her mom. She lived with her mom for the summer. Hardest time in my life. My daughter was gone, and I didn't know what to do. But some of these men that were in my life told me that I had to let her go.
Yeah.
And I had to let Monica's problems be Monica's problems, and my problems be my problems. And I made a decision at that point in time that it was more important to have a relationship with my daughter and keep her love and trust than it was to have her with me. 3 months later, she ended up going camping with us, ended up moving back in with in the home, and a couple days ago she celebrated 3 years clean and sober, Mother's Day.
Wow, man, that's a great story.
Yeah, and what's fantastic about that is on her 18th birthday, we were out kind of celebrating her life, and we love to go out for dinner and enjoy each other. And she looked at me, she says, "Dad, I am fortunate to have been misfortunate."
Yeah.
That was one of the inspirations for my book.
And it's 100% true.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's 100% true.
Couldn't be prouder of her. She's turned out to be an incredible young lady.
Yeah.
But I didn't think so. Boy, those were hard years.
Man.
Hard years.
Well, because the uncertainty of it all is just mind-boggling. When you're caught up in the middle of this, you're like, is this going to end? When's it going to end? How's it going to end? This is just, it's too much, especially after everything you've been through. Does she go, is she part of a 12-step fellowship? What did she do to get clean and sober?
I asked her that question. She actually, chapter 11 of my book, she actually has a letter in the book. I think what ended up happening with her is she saw a life when she lived with her mom that she didn't want. She told me that she watched her sister shoot up.
Ooh.
And her sister did it so that she could see it and know what not to do.
Wow.
And she says it was in that process of seeing all that stuff that she said, this isn't what I want. And it just, she lost the desire and she changed. She goes to NA and AA meetings pretty regularly now.
Excellent.
Yeah. For a season there, we went to celebrate recovery at our church together.
Beautiful.
And she writes in her letter that it was during that time that she kind of started thinking maybe she wanted to do something different because she saw me trying to get healthy.
Let me tell you, the power of example is so huge. You're either dragging them down with you or you're helping them fly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's as simple as that.
Absolutely.
No question about it. So tell us how how our listeners can get your book.
Yeah. So what I've done is I've set up a landing page for your listeners. It's just paindrivechange.com/share. They can go up there. I've got a kind of a special offer up there that the 10 steps that I just talked to you about. If they sign up, I'll send them a series of emails, give you chapter 1 of the book free. I wrote a goal setting course. I kind of talked a little bit about the goal setting course, but I'm going to give that away, and you'll find a link in there to buy the book. And I'm not trying to make any money on the book. If you buy a book and you know somebody that's in pain, I'll give you a book, and you can give the other book to somebody that's in pain, somebody that it'll help.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, I'm going to have that listed in the show notes. That's www.paindriveschange.com/share. But again, that'll be in the show notes. Do you do any social media, Facebook, Twitter? Are you on there?
I am. I'm not super active on it yet, honestly. So I'm on your Facebook, though, and I love it. It's fantastic.
Well, good. I appreciate that. Yeah, that the private group has helped a lot of people stay accountable.
Yeah.
That's for sure. So at the beginning of the episode, you talk about how your mother recently passed away in December. How are you coping with that?
I tell you what, let me tell you this story. So laid off of Microsoft in July, didn't know what I'm going to do, and I decided I'm going to write this book. So I pulled out those videotapes, and I didn't have any way to play them, right? And my son and I went yard sailing, and we found a Hi8 video camera for $7.
Oh, wow.
Put those tapes in the Hi8 video camera, and I started watching them. 4 hours later, I couldn't project it on my TV, but 4 hours later, I came up after looking through that little, scope, the camera. I said, I got to write this book. The next day, I start writing, and a couple days later, one of my routines that I exercise in the morning, I was up running, and I was listening to some music, and I just had this inspiration that I had to call my mom. And I had to say, hey, Mom, I'm writing a book, and I had to ask her to write a letter for the book. And so I called her up and said, Mom, would you write a letter? And she says, Grandma always said I was going to be a writer. I've never written. I'd love to write a letter. So I ended up spending the next 3 to 4 months with my mom, listening to her story, writing a letter, reading her my book, talking about the past, healing from the past. It turns out I still had some residual stuff. And the neat thing about that story, her letters in the first chapter of the book, she read it to me. It was one of the last letters she wrote with her hands that were so shaky she couldn't write. After this was all said and done, I said, Mom, you made a lot of mistakes, but your sins are forgiven as far as the east is from the west. You don't have to carry it anymore. And I said, is there anybody in your life that you've offended that you need to ask forgiveness for before you die? And she said, my relationship with your older daughter isn't so good, and my relationship with your dad isn't so good. I need to ask their forgiveness. My mom wrote I think maybe the last letter she wrote to my sister, said, I'm getting old. I made a lot of mistakes. I'm very, very sorry for all the stuff that happened to you as a teenager. Will you please forgive me? And my sister sent her a text a couple weeks later saying, you're forgiven. 2 weeks later, my mom went to the hospital. And to make a long story short, the last night that I visited her, she asked me, hey, son, is that book a bestseller? I said, not yet, Mom, but it's going to be. If it's God's will, it will be. And she says, I love you, son. I'm proud of you. Those were the last 2 words I ever heard from my mom. She always told me that. The next morning, the doctor called, told me Mom had passed away in her sleep. And the next morning, I woke up really early. And I went to the hospital. And I talked to the nurses that were with my mom when she died. Their names were Faith and Grace. My mom died with Faith and Grace by her side.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
You couldn't make this stuff up if you wanted to.
I know. Is it just crazy? Absolutely crazy.
Oh, what a beautiful story, man.
Yeah, it was fantastic. I mean, I am so blessed to have spent that 5 months with my mom. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Of course, now I work at Microsoft again, have a better job than I had, work in the same building. I kind of think God wanted me to write this book and spend that time with my mom.
That's exactly what he wanted you to do. There's no question about it. Yeah. Man, what an absolute beautiful story, and it's God inspired. There's no question about it. As far as I'm concerned, God walked you through that entire process for all of you, for your mom, for your daughter, for your dad, for you. What a beautiful way for her to pass on.
Yeah. And you know what's interesting? What my mom did? We found journals that she wrote. And my mom struggled with anxiety. She struggled every single day with anxiety. And we went through her journal. Every single journal she started the same way. She said, Dear Jesus, thank you for something. Thank you for the sun. Thank you that I got ice cream last night. Thank you that I could walk to the store. Didn't matter how bad her life was. It was always starting with thank you. And she would end them with guide and protect my family.
Oh, man.
25 years she did that.
I love it.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Wow. Well, listen, we're going to go ahead. I'm closing with that because that's pretty spectacular. Do you have any closing thoughts yourself, or should we leave it on that note?
Hey, I just want to say thanks for the call and the interview, and I just want to encourage the listeners. I want to spend the second half. My dream for the second half of my life is to give back what I've been given, this gift, and I'm here and available to do whatever I can to help anybody and everybody. If there's anything in my story that'll help, that's awesome.
Get this book, listeners. All right. Great suggestions. Amazing story. Damon, again, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thank you, buddy.
Man, we have now reached the end of our show. Thanks for joining us, listeners. And as we say here in Costa Rica, pura vida.
Pura vida.
Thank you for joining us on the SHAIR Recovery Podcast. To check out the show notes page on this interview or to thank our guests for sharing their story, go to www.theshairpodcast.com. While you're on the website, don't forget to sign up for our free newsletter to stay up to date on the latest news, podcasts, and interviews. Want to be one of our guests and share your story? Then go to our website and click on the Share Your Story button. We share our inspiring recovery stories every Tuesday, so subscribe to our show on iTunes or Stitcher Radio to get your free weekly download. We'll see you then. The opinions shared on this show reflect those of the individual speaker and not of any 12-Step Fellowship as a whole. And though we discuss 12-Step